welcome to an episode of Pause for Payments. I'm Kristy Duncan, and I'm so excited to have here with me Diane Joyce. Diane is a true guru and innovator, disruptor, perhaps, in the world of digital identity. And she's also on the executive of Women in Identity, so an absolute perfect person to have a chat with today. Welcome, Diane.
Thank you.
For today's discussion, I'd like to explore the topic of digital identity and how it dovetails to support advancements in financial inclusion. And Diane, you've got tremendous experience and expertise in this area, so I'm really looking forward to this discussion. So let's start by talking about who these financially excluded people are. Can you describe who this demographic is and how that profile might change in different regions of the world?
Again, well, unsurprisingly, financial exclusion tends to be associated with social and economic exclusion. So it's not just that they're financially excluded, often they're excluded from society. And I categorize them in three different profiles. The first one is people who cannot meet the legal requirements to get the access to financial services and products. So many groups such as migrants are unable to produce the documentation required by law for their proof of identity, their proof of residence. Without these, they can't even get access to basic banking systems, which tends to be the starting place for financial inclusion. The second group, I would say, are people who cannot afford the cost of financial services. Because in today's world, with many financial institutions no longer having in-person premises and restricting access to in-person premises, and that's been particularly prevalent during 2020, people need digital devices and internet access to get access to the financial services. And it's just not affordable for everyone to be able to do that. And there are also those who live in low income and low socioeconomic areas, and they tend to be evaluated as very high risk, and therefore the financial services applied to them are more expensive than perhaps those who are living in less poverty areas. And I think the third group is the people with the lack of skills and ability to access the financial services. So this includes the vulnerable who often live on the fringes of society. It includes the illiterate, those with any disabilities, be they mental or physical. And it also includes those who live in remote locations without the technology infrastructure. In other words, there's no internet, there's no place that they can go and access these services. So those would be the three groups that I'd categorize.
Yeah, and that's so interesting. And we think of these as, often only applicable in third world countries and regions, but that's not true. I know in Canada, we have many people who don't have access to the internet for a whole bunch of reasons, many of them geographic, but otherwise as well. And I see that all over the world.
I would agree with you. While the numbers of those excluded can vary greatly across the different regions in the world, the same patterns come into place. We have the same here in New Zealand, we have the same in the UK. It's just the numbers are different, perhaps when you get more into the third world. And when you get into the refugees who are moving around the third world, suddenly things become more exponential. So yeah, I would say those three groups are prevalent around the world.
Yeah, so interesting. So it's a challenge. So especially during this pandemic where people are often being drawn to digital payments, be they contactless at the point of sale or online for e-commerce purchases, but digital payment options might not be available to those who are unbanked or underbanked, undocumented, as we talked about earlier, the migrant population, what have you. How can digital identity help these people, these financially excluded people, get access to the financial services that many of us take for granted?
And we do take them for granted. I think we have to start with the legal requirements, the AML, know your customer. That's the basic way that you get access to almost any services. And I think they need to evolve to meet the needs of a much more diverse customer base. Banking was very much for those who could do it previously, but in today's digital world, everyone has to be included. So the starting point for the AML KYC requires a verified identity. And generally, this is created by using a government-issued identity document and collaborating proof of address documents. And you have to have been in a particular place for a period of time to have built up a history. But I think we need to move to a better way of doing this. And there's much better ways of doing it. We can include many more identifying sources, but unless the regulation changes and allows these sources to be acceptable, it's going to be very difficult. But instead of just having a government document and a proof of address, what happens if we triangulate identity from multiple sources? This actually provides a richer identity source and works in the first, second, and third world countries. So to me, it seems a little bit of a no-brainer. And I think the starting point for this, and I believe the digital identity industry is on the brink of doing this, is vouching. It's a great way to start to build your identity. Not everyone will have a perfect identity on day one, but if you think about a doctor can vouch for a patient, a teacher can vouch for a pupil, a religious leader can vouch for a person, social workers can vouch for their clients, and that's particularly important in the low socioeconomic group where sometimes the social worker is their number one person to go to for anything. Post offices can vouch for their clients, banks can vouch for their clients, governments can vouch for their citizens. And the list goes on. Imagine if we started to build all of that together. And whilst people say, well, some of those are quite lightweight, in regard to the current regulations, actually they become stronger as we add more and more. And this is the idea of the attestations about a person. So as we start to build this up, you can start from nothing and start to build up an identity profile that gives you a digital identity that starts you in the real world. And I think even the refugees in the camps, there's been a lot of work with the ID 2020 and the World Bank in this area. So if you think about a refugee has nothing when they arrive in the NGO camps. They have nothing. They have no documentation. Some of them don't really even know their date of birth or anything. But is that important? If we capture a biometric of that person and give them a unique identifier, they could make up their own name, it could be a number, we could do anything like that. We don't need to know their age or have any government-based documents. Every time they come to the NGO and to any associated NGOs, if they were to use that biometric, we're starting to build up a pattern of behaviour where we can start to see this person as a digital identity, but a digital identity for a real person, because that's all a digital identity is my ability to use that and getting access to services. And these refugees won't have access to technology, although mobile phones are very prevalent in the third world. They still cost money, and the refugee camps, I imagine they're like gold dust. But once we establish this, we can then start to get this pattern of behaviour and start to identify this person. But of course, having a digital identity doesn't solve the cost of financial exclusion via the cost of financial services. This is still a really big barrier to people. The risk profiles we apply to them still excludes them.
So interesting. I was talking to someone the other day who said that some innovative new approaches are being taken by the telcos in Africa, where they are looking at the social circles, which they can verify by who you're speaking to on the phone, and use that as a bit of a benchmarking to say if you're in this social circle, then that's one way of vouching for you.
And I think if you have someone who's trusted in that circle, be they a chief of a tribe or a village person who is respected, they can then vouch, and that's quite strong. And I know very much in New Zealand, there's been a lot of work with our Māori iwi. In exactly the same, or actually through the Māori iwi, which is the tribe, the belonging, vouching is often much easier than trying to get the documents associated with people. So I think we're on the cusp of that, and it is happening in Africa, and it is starting to happen around the world. Now, the first world needs to accept that vouching is just as good as your passport or driver's license.
Well, it's yes, you're right. It's the beginning of a whole new world, a whole way of looking at and verifying identity to open doors for a whole bunch of things, be they financial services or otherwise.
Mhm.
So this is really exciting. But one thing that I think we'd be remiss if we didn't talk about, and that is risk. So with these new approaches and potential new technologies often comes risk in one
Mhm.
form or another. Can you talk about the potential there, Diane, that there's new risks that we need to be aware of as we move into this world of
Mhm.
digital identities?
I think there is definitely risk, and I think my key risk would be privacy. The technology makes it easier for people to use their digital identities and to use their devices to be able to store their identity and share their information. But I think it comes at a cost of privacy, and I don't think we've necessarily cracked that yet. So, as part of my technology, if I have a mobile phone, there's an awful lot of information being gathered about me from the locations I'm at, who I call, who my circle of friends are, and whilst in some areas that's really good. For example, COVID tracing is a really good example of using technology in that way. There's an awful lot of information every time I'm in a browser. I always say Google knows more about me than I know about me. And if I ever need to remember something, I should just ask Google. And they'll be able to tell me because, you know, between my browsers, my Android devices, and everything, there's a lot of information being gathered about me. So I think the technology is very much we've gone a little bit big data, and now we're starting to think, oh, there's an awful lot of data out there. And I think in the identity industry, we're very much looking at a process of decentralized identity. And I think that's a huge step forward for privacy. So we're introducing the concept of verifiable credentials, which are pretty much the vouching things I was talking about before. So as the owner of my identity, I can actually just share an attestation saying, the government says I'm over 18. You don't need my name, you don't need my address, you don't need my date of birth. But do you trust the government? Can you go back to the government using this technology and verify that? But again, I don't need to exchange my data now. And that to me is a big step forward. I think the second concern for me about the use of technology is artificial intelligence. And I'm very hot on this. I've just done a postgrad diploma in artificial intelligence, so I could understand how it worked. And we are missing accountability for artificial intelligence in my mind. And so the forensics for artificial intelligence are sorely missing. So everything we do these days is pretty much about artificial intelligence. When you go into a search engine, it uses the algorithms and stores the information and does a lot of that. But it's also hoovering up a lot of data again. And each organization's hoovering up all of this data. And now all my data is out everywhere. So any breach from an organization has quite an impact on me. And I think that's directly as a result of the devices we use and the artificial intelligence that we apply. So the smarter our devices get, the more data they seem to accumulate about us. So it's really important that we have legislation like the GDPR in Europe, that they need to be enforced to say, you can only capture this data for a particular purpose for a particular period of time, and then you have to let go of it.
Yes, no, that's a really, really good point, Diane. And I totally agree. And it shocks me to see data that some apps and companies are requesting. I bought an automatic vacuum cleaner and I was trying to download the app and it wanted access to my location. I thought, well, you don't need to know where I am in the world to vacuum my kitchen.
No, no. And I have one of those, but being someone in cyber, I have a little network that only has those devices on it and they can't access anything else. And all these apps asking for permissions. But think about when you go and buy a pair of shoes, the consumer is focused on getting the shoes, and they will give whatever data is required to get those shoes and whatever consent is required. And when you read the consent, it says things like, we'll look at your device, and we'll look at the location, and we'll look at this, and we'll do all of these things. And the consumer's not really concerned about it. And I think that's our job as security professionals, to start stepping back and saying, no, it's not okay.
Yeah, and I totally agree, but I think sometimes the consumer is held hostage because you want the
Yep.
shoes,
Yep.
and
And
the
you want them
data is part of the cost of getting the shoes. We're kind of stuck in between this rock and a hard place.
Yes, and I think there was very much a few years ago, data is the new money, because we'll be able to monetize it, we'll be able to do everything. And I think acts like GDPR are stopping that, which I think is a step in the right direction. But I remember many years ago talking to a mobile phone operator, and when they showed me how much data they were capturing about people, because we were looking at this as a way of authenticating people and assuring people, I mean, I was truly horrified. And they said, yes, but we're subsidizing your access to a mobile network. If you want to pay, £10 per call, that will be fine. You can do that. And there's this thing called satellite phones. Go get one, because they're not tracking you in the same way, but we are subsidizing that. And I do hope that's changed, but I'm not convinced.
Well, that's why I'm glad we have digital ID and security experts like you to help hold these organizations to account and help drive the regulators to be aware and to get in front of this, because clearly GDPR is doing a good job, but it doesn't apply everywhere in the world, and it will not always catch everything.
So true.
Challenging. So before I ask my famous last question about your career, I want to just get you to tell me a little bit about what benefits of identity you are most hopeful for in the coming years.
Well, I think 2020, and I suspect 2021, will drive the use of digital identity in a greater way. And I think having people in lockdown and still needing access to services, not having branches and things, it's become clear that we need the digital identity. My real hope, though, is that the digital identity industry will collaborate in a much better way than they have previously, very similar to the way the pharma companies came together to develop a vaccine. And they did, they all came together and shared information. I think we need more in the digital identity industry, where we look at interoperability across the identity initiatives. Pretty much at the moment, each government does its own thing, and the financial services all do their own thing. And I know there are groups, countries around the world where they've started to address this, but we need to have a greater ability to interoperate between public and private sector. And I think governments are great at getting the identity started, but it's up to the financial services industry to start to get that interoperability running, because the government will do it for their services. And what I would like to see very much, and I might be a little hopeful here, is that the legislation around Know Your Customer, AML, starts to adopt the vouching system. And that can be used in a way that we start to get more and more people included. Finally, I'd really like to see digital identity embedded in COVID passports. There are going to be digital passports for COVID that we're going to need in order to be able to travel. And so I would like to see digital identity as the key thing for that, but interoperability, not this company does this and this company does that. That kind of leads to the data being shared all over the place again. But it's time for the financial services industry and the digital identity industry to come together and collaborate more.
Yes, there's lots of opportunity, and I love the way you frame that with the interoperability and the vouching to put that all together, and then looking at digital ID in terms of an opportunity for COVID credentials. And always said that we will have COVID credentials at some point going forward.
Well,
So it's a great opportunity to dovetail those initiatives.
it is.
So
And if the pharma companies can do it, we can do it.
indeed, indeed. What do you think will drive that in our industry?
I think that's the interesting thing is I think having too many COVID passports means we're either going to come down to one small set of it, and I think the technology companies will drive it. I think the big players like the Googles, the Apple, the way they did the contact tracing apps and things like that, they will start to drive that. So they will start to set the standards, and we have some standards for these verifiable credentials which can be used for vouching, but what we don't have is the interoperability standards for them. And I know all the big companies like Microsoft, Google, Apple are all starting to work in this space, so I think they will drive it. And then the financial institutions will pick up on it because the work will have started, been done, and they'll know how to implement it. And then finally the government, who it's very difficult in government to get things done quickly, will probably do it too.
Well, hopefully they'll have strong regulations around it, similar to GDPR or son of, daughter of GDPR, so that we get some good, strong controls around use of that data.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Yeah, makes a lot of sense. I love these insights, Diane. I've learned a lot here. I always, when I speak to amazing women leaders in the industry like you, close with a question that talks about your career. And you've had this amazing, successful career with a global perspective, spending half your time in New Zealand and half your time in the UK, going wherever it's warmer, whatever time of year. Is there career advice that you would share with the rising stars in our industry?
There is, and I wished I'd learnt it much earlier. I'll be the first to admit. And I think my key thing is you can be a leader without being a manager. And I think leadership is a really strong thing as you progress through your career. And I think there's a couple of ways I'd look at that. One is find a mentor. Now, I've got two. And I've had those mentors for a very long time, and they can help me when I'm indecisive or when I know things aren't going well, or I've been more disruptive than normal and it hasn't worked. So, but I often find one in the organization I'm working for as well. Someone who I can pair up with and I can start to see more from their point of view, which helps me generally in what I'm doing. So I think very much find a mentor. And the second thing is behaviors. And I was late to this in my career. I'm a talker, I'll be the first to admit. But I think listen, watch, and learn is probably what I have learned and has made the biggest value to my career. So first of all, I had to look at my behaviors. And I asked myself the question, do you always talk? Pretty much I do. And so I had to stop and I had to listen and I had to let others talk and I had to learn not to interrupt. And that was quite a learning for me. And then I had to watch the dynamics of the team to see who else is exhibiting the same behaviors. And I think through doing that, I can now become an ally to my colleagues. So I can build trust. And I have to say that's been rewarded all the way through my career. When you build an ally, it comes back in spades. So support your colleagues, especially those who need it most. And by that, I mean identify those who are not in the room and who you think should be in the room and try and get them included. And so bring them into the room, but also identify those who don't speak, but you think can add value and encourage them to speak. And there are lots of ways of doing that. The other thing is identify those who always get interrupted and help stop the interruptions. And look, I'm the world's biggest interrupter. And I think above all, be kind to everyone, because I think I learned that very early on when I stormed my way through things. Being Antipodean, I'm rather blunt in the English society, and I had to kind of learn to step back. And people always remember the kind people, they always remember the allies. And I look now, and most of my work from the last 10 years has come through word of mouth through the allies I've made. So make allies and keep that network going. I mean, I'm actually seeing someone who I worked with over 20 years ago next week.
I love that networking thing. So networking, mentoring are two very strong messages that
Very.
come from Women in Payments as well. We've got a global mentoring program. We, do lots of things that we where we encourage women to come out and network and help build that network of allies and potential clients and potential
Mhm,
um, people that you can look on to learn from or hire if you're looking to hire or what
mhm.
have you. There's so many benefits to having that network.
There is. Build that trust and be kind.
Be
Those are the 2.
kind, yes. And that was be kind was a message that came from your prime minister through the whole COVID
Very much
last
so.
year.
Yeah. But
And look where it's gotten you, COVID free. Fantastic.
it's yes, it's a little surreal, but, oh, I'm pleased I'm here in New Zealand. They've done a great job on managing COVID.
Indeed, indeed. Well, we can all learn from you in many ways. So thank you for sharing your insights, Dan. It's been fantastic. I just love your career insights. I love the privacy and the different approaches that you have outlined in terms of things that next steps that we need to do. Just understanding more about who are these undocumented and underserved people who need digital ID and can actually benefit from it the most. The whole concept of privacy is a little bit scary to me, so I will take your advice and be very, very careful with my data. And that's part of the challenge is half the time you don't know that your data is being
No.
taken or used. Anyway,
Yeah.
thank you for your insights.
Thank you.
It's been a lovely discussion, and I look forward to other discussions with other amazing women across the Women in Payments global community, and look forward to hearing you in future events. Thank you.
Thank you.